So we're in a series on holiness, and we're taking time to reflect on God's holiness, who he is, and then also as his people, forgiven and washed and redeemed, how can we live in a way that displays that holiness for the world and blesses others. And last week we talked about marriage, and we talked about this thing given by God and the roles of husbands and wives in that. So today I want to talk about singleness. We're going to talk about those who are not married, and what has God called all of us to do in terms of holiness, and how does that play out in terms of those who are not married? How can, whether married or not, how can we live as holy people? Realizing that we all come from different backgrounds, we have different stages of life, and one of the dangers with anything, any topic, any idea is that we take our cues from the world, what we see in our family, what we watch, what we read. That's what we normalize as what we think of as how to live, what we should be striving for. And so when it comes to something like singleness, I think there's two extremes that we sometimes get portrayed. So on one hand, sometimes the world portrays singleness as this terrible thing that must be avoided at all cost. Like, I grew up in an era of rom-coms where, right, the thing that you're always taught to cheer for in every movie is that the guy gets the girl. Like, that's the ultimate good of all goods. And for that not to happen would be like the greatest tragedy. And so sometimes the world portrays singleness as this thing to be avoided, or something's wrong, right? So that's one extreme. On the other side of it, you have singleness sometimes embraced as, I don't want to be tied down, right? I don't want to be shackled. I want to be free from the responsibilities, and I can do my own thing. I want to be, whether it's available or whether I want to just be able to live on my own schedule. It's this kind of thing to be pursued in terms of my convenience, my pleasure, what I want. Right, so those are two kind of extremes, and sometimes we bounce between them. Sometimes we hear this messaging. And even within the church, sometimes we do a poor job talking about this because we view marriage so highly, because we know that marriage is this gift from God. We talk a lot about marriage. We talk a lot about children. Sometimes we can either explicitly or implicitly give the impression that, again, that singleness is this less than thing. And so a lot of people in the church have felt that they're kind of the forgotten people, right? And this is no shade towards any church that has done this, but how many times have you seen church bulletin, like billboards that say, like, we're a family church, right? Signaling, like, hey, if you are a couple with kids, like, we'd love for you to be here. I don't see many billboards that say, hey, we're a singles church, right? And so I think it's helpful to acknowledge and to realize the influences that we hear, the patterns we've seen, and then to go to the scriptures and say, all right, what does God actually say about these things? And as we reflect on singleness today, it's going to actually open up a whole conversation on what we think of our whole lives and our bodies in holiness. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to read a little bit from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is a passage where Paul actually is talking about both singleness and marriage. And he's kind of bouncing back and forth. So just to know, we're going to kind of jump a little bit, because we spent some time on marriage last week. I want to focus more so on his words about singleness today. But this is Paul in a section talking about what we do with our bodies, how we understand how to live. So this is 1 Corinthians chapter 7. We're going to take some time reading this, starting in verse 6, and then we'll jump on ahead. Now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. To the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am, but if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him, and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at the time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commandments of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it, but if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of the opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freed man of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. And jumping ahead to close out this chapter, I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife. and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly toward his betrothed, if his passions are strong, and it has to be, let him do as he wishes. Let them marry, it is no sin. But whoever is firmly established in his heart, being under no necessity but having his desire under control, and has determined this in his heart to keep her as his betrothed, he will do well. So then, he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. A wife is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whomever she wishes, only in the Lord. Yet in my judgment, she is happier if she remains as she is, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God. It's a big passage, and there's a lot there. But there's a few things I want us to notice from the very get-go, okay? So for Paul, there's no hierarchy of really like, you should all be married, and, well, if you're not, okay. And for Paul, it's not, well, good Christians are single, but if you're a lesser Christian, you get married. For Paul, he holds both of these up, right? Now, he says personally, he's like, he's single, and so he's like, there's a lot of good that comes from it, and we'll talk about that. But both of these are good things, okay? Both for the married and the unmarried. These are both good things from God that have their own benefits, they have their own blessings, and they have their own challenges. But notice again, in a world training us, the end-all be-all is a romantic relationship, Paul says, no, that's not the case. Because for Paul, much more important than that is a relationship with God. That is more foundational, that is more life-giving, that is more important. And a relationship with a spouse can be a huge blessing, but that's a side thing. The most important thing is how am I with God? So notice, first of all, so both marriage, singleness, both good. Secondly, notice that for Paul, singleness is not a convenience thing. Paul is not sitting there saying, let me tell you, marriage is a drag, man. No, Paul loves marriage. He has some of those beautiful words about marriage in the Bible. For him, here's the thing. He says when you're married, you now have a responsibility. So part of your service and holy living, if you're married, is how you treat your spouse. So as husbands, sacrificially laying down your life for your wife. As a wife, respecting, honoring, and submitting your husband. That's part of your service to the Lord. Paul says, though, if you're unmarried, well, now you have extra time, energy, and effort that you can devote to serving the Lord in a variety of ways. So you can be more invested in your workplace community. You can be more invested in your church. You can be more invested in your neighborhood. So he says your anxieties are not divided. Your interests aren't divided. And so for Paul, this means there's no option, marriage or singleness, that is for just your convenience sake. Like, all right, well, I think this would be easier. If you're married, you pour everything into it. This is crucial. This is my life. One of the most important things I do is my marriage. If you're single, great. Now you have all that time and energy to devote to serving the Lord in different ways. There's no option where it's just like, all right, well, I'm just going to relax here. Now, obviously, God has designed us for rest. So this is not to say you work yourself into the ground, but it's just the reality. If I have a spouse, I have to give time and energy towards that relationship. If I don't, God has freed me up to be a blessing to my church community, to be a blessing to my neighborhood, whatever it might be. So they're both good. They're both for service. So again, there's a giving of oneself regardless. And then I just want to take note that these are kind of the two categories that the Bible creates, right? So there's marriage and there's singleness. So this is one of the things that in the biblical times, there wasn't dating like we know it. And so as Christians, one of the things that we're constantly navigating is, if I'm moving towards marriage, that's a good thing. If I'm choosing to remain single, that's a good thing. But I kind of need to move towards one of those, right? So this means if I'm dating somebody, what I'm doing is I'm spending time to evaluate, is this somebody that I can make those wedding vows to, till death do us part, for better or for worse? This is somebody I know that we can walk together in the Lord till the end. That's what I'm evaluating. And if I think no, then we end that. We cut that off. And if yes, then we pursue towards marriage. So this should inform kind of our timeline too, in terms of how much time do I need to assess to know this is somebody that I'm willing to make the commitment to, while also not dragging it out so long, because as we get closer to people, right, as intimacy grows, our bodies react and say, hey, I want to be married to this person. And so trying to find that sweet spot of what do I need to know? What can I learn to say, yes, this is somebody that I'm willing to hitch my wagon to till one of us dies, right? That's the commitment. Or, like Paul says, if you decide, I think I'm content being single and I can invest my time and energy elsewhere, great. Then commit to that I'm single. And notice, again, this is where you can be single and you can desire a spouse. I'd love to be married, and you can pray for one. But the question is, as I explore that, all right, I'm dating somebody, all right, this is not somebody that I think we're going to make vows till death do us part. All right, I'm still single, not married. And then eventually that person might come along, and God be praised, and you can get married. Those are kind of the two categories, and so we're constantly moving towards marriage. All right, let's make the commitment, and then once we've made that commitment before God and before others, then all the other stuff comes with it, right? So that's when we share a life, we share our bodies, we share our finances, we share our hopes, our dreams, our house. All of that comes with the marriage. But until that, then I'm single, and so I'm called to live holy as single, as a reflection of this is what God has designed for marriage, this is what God has not designed. I'm going to honor that with my life. And the beautiful thing, we talked last week about how marriage is this picture that gives us of Christ in the church. So how Jesus laid down his life for the church, husbands lay down your lives for your wife, and so on. Well, what singleness reminds us of, and what our single brothers and sisters, or if you are single, it's a testimony to the world that life is not found fulfillment in a spouse, but in Jesus Christ. So if you're a woman, right, a husband is a great thing, a blessing. More crucially, you have Jesus, who is the ultimate groom for his church. That he loves you, that is more life-giving and more important than you could ever get from a fallen, sinful man. Vice versa, if you're a man, there's a blessing in having a wife. At the same time, you are part of the church, which is the bride of Christ. And so you're already part of this beautiful marital relationship between God and his people that trumps all of it, right? And so singleness is this beautiful picture to the world of what really matters, right? And so again, notice, marriage points us to Jesus. Singleness points us to Jesus when we live it out rightly. What is marriage for? What am I called to do as single? And so then as a community, we're supposed to think this way. We're supposed to speak this way. And so this is a call on all of us to support those who are unmarried, right? So one thing that we do really well is we gravitate towards people like us. And so often couples hang out with couples, singles hang out with singles, families with small kids hang out with families with small kids. That's just how life works typically. And there's nothing wrong inherently about that. But notice how in the church there's this beautiful new dynamic where we're not united because we have some commonality in an affinity or life stage. We're united because Jesus Christ has redeemed us and bought us and purchased us, as we just read. And so each of us has our own assignment in life. Each of us has our own situation and dynamics. And we're called to support one another. Just like last week we talked about how it's a group effort to support marriage. Well, it's also a group effort to support those who are unmarried. Because in Genesis, God sees Adam all alone and says it's not good that man should be alone. And that's not just referring to marriage. It's true of any person. Nobody is supposed to be isolated on their own. And so as a community, we're a community that invites one another, that spends time with one another, right? This is why I love our life groups. Are just kind of all sorts of different people, different stages of life, different stuff going on, supporting one another. So it's all of our collective responsibility to make sure that nobody, married or unmarried, is ever on their own, ever isolated. Especially for those who live alone, it becomes really easy to become kind of distant, right? So it's a collective responsibility to make sure nobody's forgotten, nobody's left behind. Now, what all of this points us to is this bigger idea, right, that Paul is getting at when he talks about self-control, and that has to do with our bodies. So Paul is very clear that, hey, if you have control over your passions, you can stay single, great. But if you can't, that's okay to get married too. And all this has to do with realizing that these bodies are part of how we love God, right? So for instance, Paul in a different letter will write this to the Roman church. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. And I love this passage because he could say a lot of words, but he says, present your bodies. And bodies are such a funny thing. I often think of the small catechism. So when we confessed the creed a little bit ago, and we said, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. The small catechism says, what does it mean to think that? And the small catechism says it means that we believe that God created and still preserves to me my body, my senses, my faculties, my limbs, my parts. All of this is a gift from God. It's a gift from him to bless me. And sometimes, again, we don't think of ourselves as bodies. We think of there's like an inner self that's more real. But when God made people, he made us body, spirit, soul, lumped into one, right? And that sounds funny, but I can't be at the Great Wall of China right now because my body's right here, right? This is where I am. And you think about all of the good that we experience because of our bodies, the ways that God is able to bless us and show us his love. I think of some of my favorite memories, like sitting around a campfire and you feel the warm glow of a fire and you hear the laughter of friends hitting your ears. It's good. And I can experience it because I have a body, right? I think of when you hear a song and you can feel the bass and you just feel like you're transported somewhere else. It's like, wow, right? Or when you eat like a really, really good dessert, like I'm a sucker for cheesecake, and you're just like, thank God I have taste buds. Like, that's amazing. This body is a gift. And so what Paul is saying is we are called to then offer that body as our worship. God, if this is what you gave me, let me use it in a way that honors you. One of the challenges of a body in this fallen world is it allows us to experience things. It allows us to hear God's word. It allows us to feel the nice hug of a family member. But it also is corruptible, right? It comes with pains and aging and bruises and sickness. And then on top of it, it comes with its own set of temptations. So these bodies that can experience these really godly, good pleasures in this world also tempt us to all sorts of wrong pleasures, right? So whether it's sexually, whether it's substance abuse, whether it's gluttony, whether it's whatever it might be, pleasure-seeking, our bodies now serve as this instrument that can be used in a holy way, honoring to God by his design, or in a way that is contrary and just self-serving. And all of us have fallen, and all of us are guilty of some way, shape, or form of not honoring God with our bodies. Which is why it's only fitting that when God was looking at humanity, looking at it fallen and sinful, his solution is so beautiful because God could have said, hey, to find me and to find forgiveness, you need to escape your body, right? You need to transcend and get somewhere else. But instead, you know what God did? He took on a body like us. God, infinite, got one of these. He became flesh, and he dwelt among us. And that's beautiful. He was able to speak to people with real vocal cords and to touch them with real hands. And it was uncomfortable for him. I mean, he had to hunger, which again, when you think of the idea of God being hungry, like, doesn't make sense, and yet in Jesus it's true, right? He was tired. He had ears that could hear mockery. And eventually he was so willing to save these bodies that are sinful and corrupted that he was willing to allow his to be stricken, smited, pierced. He was willing to suffocate on a cross. When you're crucified, you eventually suffocate, slowly dying painfully. God took on a body to suffer and die so that when he rose, he might rise as one imperishable, right? So now his body can no longer be harmed or hurt. And the promise is for all who believe, these bodies which come with them so many blessings and so many challenges, one day, we just remembered on Ash Wednesday that unless Jesus returns first, these bodies will return to the ground. But one day, Jesus is going to come and he's going to pick that back up again. And we'll rise with glorious new bodies that are no longer tempted, no longer sinful, no longer aching or painful or sick, just perfect. And so if that's our future, if God has this beautiful future plan with these glorious bodies, then we, as one looking at the one who was willing to allow his body to be broken and scorned and struck for us, respond and say, okay, God, how can I use my body to honor you? The things I say yes to, the things I do with it in service and care for others, right? The things I say no to, I refrain from because that's not what you've designed, right? Realizing that my worship to you is what I do with this body. And again, this isn't because we earn favor. It's because God himself was willing to take on a body for us and loves us so dearly. And so we as his people, then we embody this. We take this and we offer ourselves and say, God, whatever you need to do with this, use it. And we remember that no matter what we've done previously, no matter what sins we've committed, no matter the ways that our bodies have not honored God, we come to him, we look at that body, we know that we are forgiven. We are cleansed. And I just want to say this, especially as we think about our bodies, if you are struggling with something, whether it's some sort of addiction or sin, there is grace and there is help, right? We're a church, you can come to me confidentially and we can, not only can I remind you of Jesus' forgiveness, but I want to help. Right? You have brothers and sisters in this room that can walk alongside you, to encourage you, to pray for you, to hold you accountable. Because God has this beautiful design for our bodies. He has this beautiful, beautiful plan. And we want to do everything we can to remind ourselves that these bodies were won, they were purchased. That Jesus shed his blood so that the blood that runs through our veins could be saved. He cares about us so much that he gave us things like baptism and communion, these sacraments, where he actually comes down and touches our bodies. Here, feel this water on your head. Taste this bread with your tongue. This is my body, right? So we do this. We support one another. I just want to say there's grace, there's forgiveness, and there's help. So may all of us, as God's people, remember the one who gave up his body to support those who are married, to support those who are unmarried, and offer our bodies as living sacrifices for the one who offered his up even on a cross for us. And his name is Jesus, and it's in his name we do this. Amen.